This is Judge Joe Brown, and you're watching We All Be News TV, the
News-free Dixie.
News-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Now we're going to hear from the United States Colored Troops by RoBErt.
Good evening. Good evening. On behalf of the United States Colored Troops Living History Association, the Camp Nelson Preservation and Education Foundation, and the 12th United States Colored Heavy Artillery Reactivated, it is my honor and privilege to speak to you today. I want to thank Ms. Callie Hurd and her committee, and also the descendants of the Fort Pillow Massacre for this opportunity. I've given a number of talks over the years, but this one was a struggle. But I kept coming back to one thought, and that thought is the title that I will use, so I address you briefly today, and that talk or title is why. Now, over the years, I've been asked a lot of questions when I'm doing either a living history presentation, taking part in a reenactment, or doing some first-person presentation. Now, the questions will vary depending on the audience or the type of event it is. Now, children typically will ask questions like, is this uniform hot? Yes. Was I in a battle? And they're meaning Civil War battle. No. Was I ever wounded, or did I kill anyone? They'll ask me how old I am, and I have trouble convincing some of them that I really was not born in 1845. They will also ask, was I a slave? Now, I struggle with that one because if it's a child, I have to tell them no because they don't understand. If I get asked that by a child and the adult is there, I tell the adult yes. I tell them yes because Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment until March 22nd, 1976. I was 26 years old and still a slave. But they kind of understand that. Now, with adults, I get a different set of questions, particularly if someone's doing a formal interview. How did I get involved? Long story. How long have you been doing this? What can you tell me about your regiment or Camp Nelson or about the United States Colored Troops in general? Am I a descendant? And was I ever in the military? The question that I am never asked is, why do I do it? Now, just briefly, I'm going to try to answer that question from my personal perspective. I did not serve in the military, nor can I prove that I am a descendant, although 2/3 of all African American men of military age in Kentucky served in the Union Army during the war, and Kentucky is my home. Why am I here? Well, there are several reasons, and some of you may have some of the same reasons, particularly if you portray members of the United States Colored Troops or the women who supported them. 3 reasons. First, I enjoy history. However, one thing I learned is that many historians fail to include the African American perspective or contributions in their works. We're too often relegated to just a few lines or paragraphs. Or we often learn of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth, but they omit the names of people like Thomas Morris Chester, the only African American correspondent during the war. We don't learn of John Crowder, who was considered the youngest officer in the Union Army and was killed at the Battle of Port Hudson. No one knows the name of James Stone, who enlisted in the 1st Fighter Artillery of Ohio on August the 23rd, 1861, and he's considered the first African American to serve during the Civil War. We don't know about Nicholas Biddle, who was the first casualty of the war when he was hit in the head by a stone on April 18th, 1861. Secondly, this is our history. It is both African American and American. The problem is that it is often not told or interpreted from our perspective. Case in point, 1928, W.E. Woodward published a biography entitled Meet General Grant. In his introduction, he observed that, and I'll quote, "The American Negroes are the only people in the history of the world who ever became free without any effort of their own." 1928. Even later works tend to downplay the role of the United States colored troops in Americans' history. I had one noted author tell me we didn't contribute much. The events that occurred at Fort Pillow on April the 12th, 1864 are typical. They are usually interpreted around the actions or inaction of Nathan Bedford Forrest and his men. Now, the aim is normally to vindicate Forrest, but from my perspective, and Doctor, you gave me a few others to consider, it was the result of events that occurred just a few days earlier in Paducah, Kentucky. You see, when Forrest and his men ransacked Paducah, the Union garrison fell back to Fort Anderson. And Forrest and his men attacked Fort Anderson again and again. And they were driven off each time, particularly by the artillery fire that was coming from the fort. And those ignorant men manning the artillery were newly enlisted members of the 8th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. I can't prove it, but I think they were mad because their butts got whooped by some black soldiers. Finally, I have a debt to pay. The real reason that I do it. Each time that I put on this uniform, I'm not important. But I am reminded of the 200,000 African Americans that fought for my freedom and the nearly 40,000 that died. They are the ones that are important. I think back to July in 1863. Prior to the issuing of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, when two men from Kentucky, James and Joshua Speed, friends of Lincoln and slave owners, visited him in the White House. And James Speed warned Lincoln, he said, "The Negro cannot be emancipated by proclamation. Let the Negro be no party to the force which is applied to his liberation." But it was our participation that turned the tides of war in favor of the North. Now, I understand that these men, they fought, they died, but not for themselves. See, they did it so that each of us today might enjoy liberty and freedom. Who is going to honor those visionaries if we don't do it? There were men like those from the 62nd United States Colored Infantry who raised $6,300 of their own to open Lincoln University in Missouri in 1866 to educate their children and our people. There were men like two brothers from Simpsonville, Kentucky, Henry and Elijah Mars, both runaway slaves, that taught school in Kentucky and Indiana, and then established what is now Simmons University in Louisville, Kentucky. There were men who formed and pastored many of the churches that we sit in today. These men fought for justice. They fought for voting rights. They fought for rights that many of them never enjoyed, but they did it for every one of us standing here or sitting here today. These are the men that I am indebted to, and if I don't tell their story, who will? So before I take my seat, I just have two questions for you all. First is, why are you here? Now, maybe you were invited or you enjoy history. Maybe you're here because you are a descendant. Maybe you're here to honor the 20,133 men from Tennessee that served during the war. Your reasons may be different. Doesn't matter. Because the last question is the important question. What are you going to do tomorrow? Are you going to let the memory of our ancestors die? Will you let others interpret our history, neglect our contributions and our unique perspectives? Or will you take a stand, put on a uniform, put on a dress, and help me repay the debt that we all owe? Thank you.
Thank you so very much.